Thank you for taking the time to come out to the ward today. Appreciate it. So we've already had a chance to sit down previously. We sat down and we talked a little bit about the structure of our government as well as the personal, individual responsibilities that we have. You care to elaborate on that before we jump into it, or how you came to those conclusions?
Well, just maybe a word that we see in our government, and Washington and the Founding Fathers understood this very well and had a real good grasp of this, that there were internal qualities that the people of America had by virtue of the background of the colonies, the founding of the colonies, the beliefs, the Christian influence of the Bible on the various colonies, and the prime desire for religious freedom for all the colonies, for every colony. It was somehow attached to practicing your faith without interruption from the government. So that was a given among most of the colonists, and our Founding Fathers understood the root of that was really an internal faith. There were internal qualities that were needed among Americans, the colonists, and then when it came to founding a government, and there were a number of state constitutions that were already set up. The very first one was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1638. Connecticut, which if you look at their license plate today, has the Constitution State on the bottom of it, and that's why, because they had the very first written constitution in world history. And of course, they were the first colony with a constitution. But that was sort of this thing that the Americans did. They wanted to protect their rights. They wanted to hammer out a government that would do that and that would be limited. So it was a limited, kind of two cardinal virtues in a way. Limited government was true throughout the colonies, and that was the kind of the worldview that they came from. And then secondly, they wanted and saw the need for self-government. So individually self-governed under God was very much needed in order for you to have a government that was limited. So if the people themselves lack self-government, if they're wild and crazy and they vote themselves largesse and all kinds of stuff that they don't need or do, then at some point the government steps in to kind of restore order and reason, I guess. Our founders were really upset and concerned with democracy for that very reason, where 51% of the people voting on an issue would take it in that direction. That majority could then stomp on the minority. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, written in 1830, said that he actually used that term, the tyranny of the majority. And so they were afraid. Again, they wanted to guarantee and protect their religious freedom and their rights and not have a government that would be out of bounds and trample on that. So then we come to the three major pieces or forms that are necessary, kind of the external form of the government. And the government itself had to be based on the internal qualities of the people, but then the external form would be such that would prevent a democracy from forming. You'd have checks and balances. You would have different branches of government. It would be very difficult for the people to just be, a 51% majority rules tyranny over the others. So I don't know if that gives you a little bit of background. I'd say the two things I'd really like you to remember are self-government and limited government. So self-government of the individual and limited governmental power.
I think that's great, and I think that's important for everybody to remember, because the structure of our government is not determined on it being a democracy. People always say democracy, but they forget that we're a republic, and a republic is based on representation.
Right.
So obviously, it's very apparent that you have a lot of information and a lot of knowledge. Would you mind telling me just a brief introduction about yourself and about how you know so much about this and how you implement it?
I've studied it for years, and I think that anybody can be someone like me if you study it and learn it, and then you teach it for again and again and again. Those things just stick after a while. So you do. There's something to be said about experience and reading and study. I think that's a neat thing about older people. Now that I'm an older person and I can make that statement, is that you have, generally with older people, you have this wealth of experience. And I'd like to encourage the younger people to step in there. So I think for me, I had an interest in history. I've told many people that when I was in mid-high and high school, the thing that struck me about history was the amazing stories of what people would go through. I loved biography. I loved hearing about someone like George Washington Carver, who was born a slave, who had no advantages. He didn't even know who his parents were, and adopted by a white family after the Civil War. And the white family promoted and encouraged him in schooling. And then lo and behold, he faced failure after failure. He tried to homestead and was forced off the 160 acres in Kansas by a drought, and he lost everything he had. And yet you see this guy, because he loved to learn, because he kept going, and he had this tremendous faith in God. At age 10, he became a Christian, and he believed God had a special plan for his life. So he didn't know what that was, but he stayed with it, kept going, and then he becomes one of the greatest scientists of America's history, developing the peanut, 300 uses of the peanut, 300 different uses just from a peanut, not combining it with corn silk or, tobacco, some substance, but just the peanut, and taking that and coming up with 300 different uses, was able to encourage people to plant peanuts, because now it was a profitable crop. And when they planted peanuts, the soil responded, the soil renewed with nitrogen, and the South's economy and whole agriculture was changed. And he's attributed as being the person who turned the kind of the destruction of Southern agriculture, made a turn, and today we see a thriving country in the South. So, all that to be said is that I'd read someone like that and just marvel at how they stuck with it and what they had to go through. And so in college, I went and took a number of history classes, and you get the big picture, you get the big sweep of survey classes, Western civilization, etc., American history. But then I ran into a group called the Pilgrim Institute, just this little institute up in Indiana that taught these biblical principles that we see in our national history and that influenced how men and women thought. And it was fascinating to me. I remember sitting for a week, listening to from 8 to 4, I think, for 5 days, listening to a presentation of American history, and it was fascinating. And it was from a providential perspective of God's hand in history. And that, I just fell in love with that. And so I've had an intense interest. I've read, a lot. Right now, I was going to say, right now I'm reading the second volume of Lee's Lieutenants. It's from the Civil War. It's just an area I've never read, this classic book. And so I just keep reading. I've had students who've asked me, gosh, Mr. Kinzer, you must read a lot. Actually, I'm a slow reader. I'm a very slow reader. And some days I'll read 4 pages, And so it's maybe, I think what it is, like anything, if you just stay at it, it's that drip principle,
Yeah, that's interesting. I can tell you're a big reader, and it also sticks. So that's good. So one thing I'm curious about, do you read a lot of biographies?
I do, yeah.
And what's the same theme across all biographies?
The same theme.
General
across,
high level, not a trick question. A biography is what?
well, it's the story of the person.
That's the point.
Yeah.
That's my key point.
Right.
So you are interested in an individual's journey. You brought up Washington, you brought up Tocqueville, you brought up several other individuals,
Right.
but you keep talking about them as the individual. I think a lot of the times in modern society, we get so caught up with the fact that the process of government is just blowing past us. It seems like it's something that's far away and detached from us, but the reality is it's not, right? So if we want to get back to the big three, the first one, it goes back to the democracy versus a republic. It's about representation, correct? Mm-hmm. So the representation, who is being represented?
The people. The people are being represented by individuals they elect. And then, so we do have a democracy one day a year. We go to the polls, and 51% elects the representative or the senator or the delegate or the state governor or whatever. And then the rest of the year, the governor, the state representatives, they represent the people. And that's where I think we have failed. I think in our modern period, we have not been active. We've not been watchful of our liberties as we should have been. And so people will always be there to take away freedoms or to try to grab power. Man's selfish nature is a big part of that. And so we have to be vigilant as a people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because we individually, I know for me previously, I didn't think that I had a part to play. I thought that, in the Bible it talks about a good soldier doesn't mind the affairs of the government, right? He just does what he's told. He picks up his sword and goes to battle, right? So for me, previously, I had a loose understanding of scriptural things, and I was as much of a Christian as having Christian non-denominational on my dog tags. So that's as much as I believed in my faith. Equally as much as how much I believed in the type of government we have, despite the fact that I had raised my hand and swore to go protect the Constitution, I knew very little about it. I knew there was a Constitution. I knew it was something that I said that I would protect. I didn't understand how the Constitution played into the form of government that we had. And then the form of government that we have is only beneficial if we have that representation. And we can only have the representation with two things. One, people being active, and then two, people actually participating and, like he said something very important. He said being watchful. So part of our process is we need people to watch the process, people to make sure that everything's happening exactly how it's supposed to. I actually want to point something out. So this last election that went past, there was an election station right up at the community center up here. I was walking in, voted, I walked out. On my way out, there was several different individuals that were setting up tables to campaign and provide information. I'm like, what are you doing here? That's curious. That's an interesting take. Yeah. They're like, oh, we're just providing information. You know what they said? Because people's taxes just came out, we want to make sure that we're available to answer questions for them. I was like, are you here representing an elected official? Yes. You cannot be here. You need to leave. So they started bucking the system. So what did I do? I called the hotline, the Election Integrity Hotline. I said, hey, I don't want to make myself look like a fool, but I'm pretty sure this is not okay. They said, well, tell me a little bit more about it. So I went in, I walked in, pulled out my phone, said, are you going to leave? They said, no. I said, okay, then I'm going to record. I took a video and I said, this is what they're doing. Today's election day. The election's location is right over there. I sent that off. Within 20 minutes, they were packing up and leaving. So we have a part. We have a part. We need to be bold. We need to be courageous.
That's right.
So that's representation.
Yep.
After representation, you talked about the separation of powers. The idea of the separation of powers comes back to federalism, right? Federalism is the key point that you were talking about for the separation of powers. Can you talk through federalism and how that affects us?
You want me to mention separation of powers too? Or
I would say federalism, separation of powers, individual, just like we talked about, the tier. So you have individual, then county.
Yeah. So there are three external features or traits of a republic. And a republic, the dictionary defines a republic as anything, the modern dictionary defines anything other than a monarchy. That's what the new Webster's says. In reality, a republic is a form of government where the people rule through elected representatives. That's the better definition. The people rule, but it's through elected representatives. And there's three forms that really need to be there for a republic to operate. You have to have representation, so the people have to choose their representatives, but you also have to have federalism. And federalism is power. If you can picture a pyramid, and at the bottom of the pyramid you have the people, and then the local government, which is closest to the people, is the lower level of that pyramid. They do everything they can to serve the people. They're elected by the people. But the things that the local government cannot do are moved up to the second level. That's county. So the county is above the local government. County does those things that the local government can't do. Then those things that the county can't really accomplish goes up to the third level, state. And then the things that the state cannot do goes to the national government. So the national government isn't supposed to be all-encompassing. The national government is very limited. It's only doing those things that the local, the county, the state governments cannot do. So each level has its own jurisdiction. If you have a pothole and you have a problem with your road, you don't call the national government, you call the local government that are close by, and it's very efficient as well. So it gets very inefficient when the national government starts jumping down and doing things that these other levels should be doing.
And so that what you're covering there is federalism, correct?
Federalism, right.
So the first one we already covered, the second is federalism, and then the third one, that's separation of powers.
Separation of powers, right.
So we have federalism, which separates the powers from the ground level up to the national federal level.
Right, different levels of government, each with its own jurisdiction. Right, that's federalism.
Okay. And is there anything else that we should cover or know about federalism, or why it's special, or why the founding fathers decided to go with that?
They were reluctant to give the national government too much power, so having the power divided on these different levels was a great advantage, to guaranteeing that you wouldn't get oppressive government. I mean, obviously, the closer the government is to the people, the easier the people can watch that government. If the the national government takes over stuff that used to be done by the states or the localities, it's real hard for us to see what a person in Washington, D.C. is doing. It's much easier to keep track if you can just go down and see your city council, or you can go up to Santa Fe and see your state government.
And so that's why when people say petition to your state leaders, correct?
Right.
So if you see something that's happening at a national level, the appropriate response is to do what? If you have a complaint or something you want to bring to their attention.
Yeah, well, I think the appropriate response is to contact your representative. On the national level, it'd be your U.S. representative. And for us, Melanie Stansbury, and ask her office to look into this or write a letter. You could put a petition in. You could have an issue that you send it to your representative. That would be the best first step, I think. Yeah.
So get together, put together a petition, make sure it is that you're very clear about what the problem is and how you expect them to help resolve it, correct?
Yeah.
So you put together the petition, you send that up, and then they can take action on it, which brings the voice of the people at the bottom to the people at the top, so they're aware that there's an issue that the people do not agree with what they're pushing.
Right.
Okay, so that's a good overall covering of federalism. So now if we go into separation of powers, obviously we just laid out the power structure and how the hierarchy flows. What was the separation of powers, and how did they come up with that option?
Well, that's a good question. Separation of powers, the founding fathers separated the power in any branch of government or any level of government into three branches. A guy by the name of Montesquieu, back in the 1700s, wrote a book called The Spirit of Laws. And in that book, he took governmental power. He said, with any power, there's always three separate distinctions within that power. There's an executive carrying out the law, there's a legislative function making the law, and there's a judicial function judging the law. And so he wrote that, and our founding fathers read Montesquieu. Montesquieu was one of the most widely read philosophers, and it was kind of a no-brainer during the colonial days. Almost all the state governments had three branches. You know, you had your executive, legislative, and judicial. So each branch was separate. The judicial branch cannot make laws. That's for the legislature. That's the people who are elected by the people. The executive branch cannot make laws. That's, you know, again, the legislative branch. The executive branch carries the laws out, executes the laws. And failure to execute the law brings, you know, impeachment. You know, you can be impeached. A president or a mayor or a governor could be impeached, you know, the executive power of that level of government. And then, of course, judicial judges the laws. And so each branch is separate. You keep boundaries between the branches. The idea was it would be very hard for one person to pull all that power together. If it's separated into three branches, it's going to be tough to have a dictator. It's going to be very... Now, Hitler jumped into Germany as the chancellor. I believe in 1933, he was elected chancellor, and he began to dominate the judicial branch by appointing judges that he wanted in there, and he started dominating the legislative branch, again, by cowering the legislators. I think it's called the Reichstag. I'm trying to remember the term for the German legislature. But so he controlled it, even though he was not physically present in all the branches, but he controlled that. If you separate them out, it's harder for a person to control. And then, of course, you have federalism. So on each branch, these three branches, on each level of government. So on the local level, your city council, you've got a mayor, executive, town council, city council, legislative, and you have your local courts. On the next county level, you have the same thing, county manager, county commission.
And you have county courts at state level. So each branch, each level, is separated into those three branches. If someone seizes power, it's very difficult to do that. Could they do that? Yes, they could do that. But hopefully they'd be stopped before they get too far.
Yep. That's good. No, I appreciate it. So that's the overarching theme of the big three. So Celio, when you asked earlier, what's the big three? You got your answer. So there's the big three. So we're going to wrap up on the big three, and we're going to prepare to move into the internal six. So anybody who has a question, you can go ahead and move up to the front, and we'll get a microphone to you.
So we have two questions over here. After him, I've actually got a question.
Yeah. Okay.
What are the big six?
Big six. That's a good question, and that's going to be the whole next section. Great question.
Good question. Yeah, the big six are actually the most important part of the whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a good question, and this is something I wrestle with constantly. I talk about this sort of stuff all the time on my radio show.
Good.
But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as far as we've got state constitutions and we've got the U.S. Constitution. So we've got the Second Amendment in the U.S. Constitution that states shall not be infringed. Yet we have state governments which infringe upon the Second Amendment all the time. So who exactly does the U.S. Constitution and the Second Amendment apply to?
Well, the U.S. Constitution, very good question, and a bewildering application, because we do see a lot of consistent. We do see a lot of inconsistency in how that's applied. But the U.S. Constitution, and when they signed on to the Constitution, it says the Constitution becomes the supreme law of the land. I think it's maybe Article 4 in the Constitution. And that means it supersedes any state laws, that the U.S. Constitution must be supreme over the state, not their constitutions, but over their laws that they pass. So New Mexico, for instance, could not pass a law that banned the ownership of firearms, okay, because that's a guaranteed right under the Second Amendment. And so if New Mexico did that, if any state did that, there'd be a lawsuit, and it would go probably to the Supreme Court, where they would hopefully support the Constitution. But again, you have to have the character of the judges of such that they honor the Constitution. If they don't honor the Constitution, if they think the Constitution is a, quote, living document that just changes with time, because times are a-changing, and so anything can happen, that's not sticking with the Constitution. That's a very fluid, relative view. I don't know if that answers your question.
Not exactly.
Okay.
But I think the thing I'm constantly thinking about all the time is, the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is extremely clear. Shall not be infringed means shall not be abridged, shall not be interfered with in any way whatsoever, right. And yet they've passed law after law that infringes. Yeah.
Well, I would say that those laws are unconstitutional, but
I would too.
But the Supreme Court has ruled, and I haven't made a study of all of the gun laws and the progress of, trying to rid our country of firearms. I haven't studied that real closely, but I'm sure there are Supreme Court cases where the judges have ruled, against, the Second Amendment, and saying things like, well, you don't need an AR-15, and these were hunting. This militia is just a group of hunters, and it wasn't, but they will say that,
Yeah, I think we're on a lot of loose ground right now when it comes to the structure of our system of governance. I think there's a lot of people that would like to change it, a lot of things that other people would prefer not be in place, because those things being in place continue to hold the line, and we have no idea how much that's like a dam holding back the tide. So I'm very grateful for the fact that you're here and you're educating us on those things, and we're covering the big three, and now we're going to go into the individual six. So the individual six, this is interesting. So I got to sit down with John, and I picked his brain for a little bit, and I said, what's most important? How do you think we could structure this? What are the things that you think are the most important for us to take away? And why do I say that? The reason I say that is because we're having this conversation because we're on a journey. We're on a journey together to get to somewhere. And the place we're trying to get to is the place where you understand exactly what your role is and what your responsibility is in this government. So the first of the self-governance is self-governance.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes?
That's a principle of self-government, right? To government, and I'm going to be mentioning Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, which is the original Webster's dictionary. He's a Christian. He became a Christian in 1808, and then in 1828 had published his dictionary, which took 20 years to do. He did it all himself. It's an amazing story. Again, biography. There's your biography.
That's right.
But in the original dictionary, he says a government is anything that does four functions. It controls, directs, regulates, or restrains anything else. And so government could be family government. It controls the members of the family. It could be a school government. It controls the pupils, the teachers. It dictates what should be done and what shouldn't be done. So you have a large number of types of government. A business can be a government. You know, the employees are limited by what the employer agrees to, and their job is defined. You know, they have to be directed by the employer, the company, etc. So you have all these different kinds of government. Civil government is just one type of government. But self-government is the root of all of those kinds of governments. You can't have good employees unless they are governed. You can't have an effective school unless there's self-government. You can't have an effective family unless it's self-government, or a church, or a national government. There has to be that understanding of self-government and people who are restraining themselves, controlling themselves, directing themselves. And so that's got to be there.
Yeah, so self-governance, big picture, you're thinking the best or an easy way to summarize that is doing the right thing when nobody's looking.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate?
That's good. Mm-hmm.
Self-governance. So do the right thing when nobody's looking, because somebody's always watching. Next, we're talking about governance. When we talk about the self, that leads to individualism. Correct?
Right.
So talk about the next principle,
Yeah.
which is individualism.
Yeah, or I would refer to it maybe as individuality, but,
Sure.
but it's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, so God has made everything different. Every single person has different fingerprints, has different eye color, has different height, has a different manner of walking. I mean, it's obvious, you know, we see all this variety among people, as an example. We also see it with colors. We see it with stars. We see all this individuality displayed throughout nature. And so there's this principle that God must like making things unique and different. And he delights in those things. That's how he's made his creation. And so as you look at individuals, we should be honoring that. We should look at an individual who's different, and they should have a great deal of honor because number one, they're made in the image of God. He created them. But number two, he's made them differently, and we shouldn't try to make everyone the same. We shouldn't, as an example, in education, why would we take all these kids who are 6 years old and put them all in one class and teach them the same curriculum, that use the same methods on all of them when they're all very diverse learners, you know? And they learn at different speeds, they're at different stages. I remember as a teacher I was a sixth grade teacher for several years, and I would have students with their scores coming from a skills test, the Iowa Basic Skills Test, and I would have students in my sixth grade class that ranged from fourth grade abilities all the way to 10th grade, just in a sixth grade class. So you've got all these kids with different abilities, and you're teaching them the same way with the same curriculum, and each year they move through the system. So we're treating them all as if they weren't individuals. See? And a system of government that doesn't have regard for this uniqueness and this individuality would say, hey, everybody should have the same income, live in the same homes, have the same education that the state governs to make sure it's the same throughout all 50 states, the same retirement, the same, so, it goes on, and that's socialism. That's the basis of, you say, well, we got to treat everyone the same. Well, everyone should be treated the same for their rights and their liberties, and they should be held accountable for their actions, But people are very different. They're not the same in so many areas. So we should value that. And we should have a government that would value that. So if people in New Mexico or Texas or Virginia, they have a certain value system or they have certain things they'd like to see in their curriculum, they should have a say, that they should have the individuality of being able to bring that up with their school boards and have that taught as part of their curriculum. It shouldn't be a national curriculum that treats everyone, the same, teaches the same.
That's good. So we start with self-governance, then we go to the individual. The individual, as individuals, we engage in different activities. We do things, right? So when we're doing things, there's cause and effect. So cause and effect, another thing that is similar to cause and effect based on our actions and then the result of those actions. Another principle that we talked about was sowing and reaping. Can you talk about how that applies to the self-governance?
Yeah, I think sowing and reaping comes right out of the Bible. All of us would see what we sow, we're going to reap down the line. But Galatians, I think chapter 6, says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man sows, he will also reap." And then it goes into talking about sowing to the flesh versus sowing to the spirit, and it goes into a fuller discussion there in Paul's letter. But we see that, a farmer who sows seed, if he wants a crop of wheat, he doesn't throw corn seeds out. If he's going to throw corn seeds out, he's going to get a crop of corn. The harvest, the reaping is going to be determined by what you sow. And if we can teach our kids that, boy, that is a great spot to understand, what do I put my life to, what I sow into my life, what I allow to come into my life from programs and books I read and influences that I have. There's going to be a reaping that's going to affect me down the road. So directly influences self-government.
Do you think sowing and reaping works two ways, where stuff can be sown into us and then we produce the harvest of what people are trying to put into us?
Yes, and I think that's part of the great push with public education is we have a lot of educators who, 100 years ago, got a vision to change society, reap a different culture, a different society.
By sewing things into their students, and we saw that, and we're witnessing that now. We're part of the chaos, part of the problems that we have is due to that viewpoint, which it works. It works. If you whatever you sow yourself to, a couple of you all I know out in the audience, if you sow yourself to hiking and keeping physically fit, there's a result down the road there. You're going to benefit, you're going to reap from that. So I think, our kids can pick up on that very quickly. But we need to work with them, make sure that they understand that.
And I think part of what you're talking about with the sowing and the reaping, there are individuals, like you said, about 100 years ago who came together and they said, let's go ahead and start implementing these things to change the foundation of the government.
And when they came to go against the foundation of the government, they did not attack the big three. What did they attack? They attacked us. They came after us. They knew they could make us do what they wanted because we as people are impressionable. So we talk about self-governance, the individual, and sowing and reaping. So if anybody can sow and reap anything, what is the thing that our founding fathers highlighted about the individuals and what they sow and what they reap? It goes back to the golden rule, right? So the golden rule is about do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
That's a direct sowing and reaping scripture. Yeah.
Sowing and reaping.
Very good. Yeah.
But if there's people who are not acting and upholding that golden rule, which we know that golden rule comes from historical Christian background, well, our nation was founded on historical Christian background. And actually that's something that you highlighted earlier as you were talking about how influential the Pilgrims were and how influential the belief structure was. So we go all the way back to the very beginning and we wonder, how were they able to sow and reap and sow and reap and get to the point that we're at now? Well, because they had something else, and it was about their character, a Christian character. The Christian character built off of biblical doctrine that directed the way that they acted. And that ties in directly with self-governance, does it not?
That's right.
So how did the Founding Fathers display and act out that Christian character when they were building this process and how it affects the individual?
Good question. And it's really a question that all of us have because we want to impact our children, our grandchildren. We want to impact the next culture. And we want to sow truths into their hearts, just like their hearts would be similar to soil. And truths and values and beliefs would be like the seed that goes into the heart and will one day bear good fruit. If the wrong seed gets planted, then when they get older and older, the fruit is like weeds. And you guys have all pulled weeds and know it's a lot harder to pull them out when you're 30 years old. They got deep roots down in the heart. You got to yank and tear that root. It's much easier to tend the heart of a younger person and remove those weeds before they get at such a grip. So we need to be sowing the right kind of seed into people's lives. And with Christian character, when we think of the character qualities of Christ, faithful, loving, giving, generous. We could make this big list. And we need examples. We need to be reading the scripture to our kids and our grandkids. I long for the day when we'd see the scripture again in public schools, I think one of the reasons we got some of the problems we have is that we've taken God's word out of the schools. The 10 Commandments used to be on the wall of courthouses. And I know a friend who works for Judge Roy Moore, who you maybe remember, the Alabama Supreme Court Justice, who said he would not take down those 10 Commandments off the wall of the courthouse or the state court. And those kind of things we need to work. If we have a goal and we're working toward establishing and reestablishing biblical self-government and Christian character and sowing and reaping, we need to be doing that on the level of our homes first. And really it starts right here in us. We need to know what what we believe, and we need to be convinced of those truths. And so I think you're absolutely right when you are saying, we need to know what we're aiming for, what we aim to do, what is our goal as meeting together and helping candidates be elected. We need to understand what we're about. So I think for me, the greatest example of Christian character, probably the easiest group to teach in your school or in your home, is the Pilgrim story and the things the Pilgrims went through, how they treated the Indians as equals, how they never had the treaty they had with Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribe. That treaty was never violated. Show me one that in American history that wasn't violated. That one was never violated. And so the Pilgrims and of course the struggles that they went through just to get over here, and then the first winter of living in Plymouth, and over half their number died in the first winter. And they had seven of their leaders. Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth colony, writes about those 7 men who served all the people who were sick and feeling terrible, and they were dying. Sometimes up to 3 people a day died, and they would at night bury them. If you go to Plymouth, there's a hill real close to the little town area. They call that Burial Hill. And they buried them up on the hill because they didn't want the Indians to know how weak they were becoming and how weak they'd become. And so at the end of the winter, when they took stock of where they were, the Mayflower was out in the harbor. And the Mayflower had stayed the entire winter in Plymouth Harbor. the ice had come in and locked it in. Now it was March, and they could go back to England, and they said, hey, we'll take back anybody that wants to go back with us. Anybody want to go back? Not one pilgrim went back. And I look at the character of that group, and I think of our churches today. You know, if we went out and we planted a church and half the people died the first winter, how many churches would just say, oh, you know, that's what, we're coming back. You know, that's the Lord showing us not to do that. That's his hand. You know, many people would conclude that. That's not what the Pilgrims concluded. They saw it through, and they became what's known as the seed of America. They became that choice seed that was planted here of self-government, a love of God, planting the Word, bringing God's Word over, planting it here, trying to live by His Word and how they treated others. They're a great example. So it's fun to teach that. It's fun to pull those truths from the Pilgrim story.
I think that's interesting that you circled back to the Pilgrims, because when we talk about the individuals who founded our nation, that initial push of people that came up on the shores, they tried several different things before they figured out a process that was working, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, a big thing that was tried early on was more of a community.
Right.
We're going to do this together. And what happened when they tried to do it together?
Well, they had everything in common, and they had what they call a common store system. And so all their crops from everyone were put into a common store, and then everyone drew out of this. So it was a socialistic system. And you would think that with the Pilgrims, with the quality of character that they had and the quality of commitment that they had, that surely the common store would work. You know, I mean, it's like we're in this together, you know. And you know what? It wasn't working. They were starving to death, and they took it aside and they said, okay, we're going to let everybody have a plot on their own that they can grow stuff. And it's not going to be a common store. And so that year, that spring, more people than ever went out and planted. And there was much more activity. Bradford writes that even the young ones would go out in the fields with the mothers, where before both would say, well, it's too much work for us, you know, but now they're motivated. And they realize there's a yield for their efforts, an increase for their efforts. So they had as Bradford says, that next year they had an abundant harvest. And of course, that was one of the years they had Thanksgiving with the Indians. They invited the Indians over, and they celebrated God's goodness and His taking care of them. And so it's a great story, yeah.
That's a good one,
but
yeah.
Socialism didn't work for the Pilgrims. And you would think of all the people in our history, it would work, but it didn't.
That's right, yeah. And so that brings me back to what I was talking about before. So some people think that if we do everything as a community, we lock arms and we're going to go this way together, that's just the best way to do it inherently. Well, not necessarily, because the next principle touches on what you just touched on. So they went from community, we're all going to work together and we're going to work this piece of land together. And then they said, this is not working. Everybody gets their own chunk of land, and you're going to work that land. And that land is yours. Yours. What is the power in something being yours? Personal property. So the next principle is personal property.
In the beginning, the Creator gave to man dominion over the earth. And this is the basis of property. And it's just beautifully written. You guys, you need to get an 1828 dictionary and read some of those definitions because this is the way they thought. This is the way the founding fathers were thinking. So it's saying that God, who made everything, God's the Creator, and He gave to man dominion to rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the creatures that creep on the face of the earth. Notice there's one thing left out of there, man. Men were not supposed to rule over men, but all the animals, all the rest of the creation. So slavery is out, slavery is not a biblical idea. It's interesting though, because Israel did have some slaves, and there are some things that mention slavery in the Old Testament, but you look at that and it's pretty clear, slavery is not the best thing that we should, in fact, it's pretty bad. We need to move away as quick as we can from slavery.
Well,
if
slavery,
we have
so
it, you know.
if we're talking about personal property and then slavery, there's actually a thread there, right? There was believed that with slavery that people could be personal property.
Right.
And then we abolished that. The United States actually worked actively to remove that.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
So, but personal property, so that has taken on a lot of forms. But again, we talk about if something is yours and you want to do something with it.
Yes.
Right? So that's your stuff. You're going to care for it. You're going to tend to it. And you're going to see that it produces a yield.
Exactly. And if you see that God has made you a steward, that you're responsible to Him, that He's entrusted these things to you, and you realize that He owns everything. It says in Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell in it. So everything in the world, even all the people, everything is the Lord's. So whatever I have as my property, I am accountable to God. Wow, that changes everything. That changes your whole perspective, how you use things, how you treat other people, And so, it's going to affect how your sowing and reaping goes, how, it affects every area.
And you're not going to respect anybody's property if you don't value them as an individual. So if you don't believe in the individual rights of a person, then you're not going to worry about their personal property. And you'll do whatever you see fit and take it as you would like to. Right? Okay, so we have personal property, and then, so not taking other people's stuff brings us to the final point, and that is unity and union. Would you like to take it from the top on unity and union?
Yeah, so that's kind of a funny phrase, unity and union. So what in the world how did Webster define that? And he said unity was agreement in the mind and the heart of people, of two people, two individuals, I think is what he said. And so basically unity is when you agree with someone on various things. And it's an internal quality. He also says that it's an internal quality in the heart, and it's agreement you have with another. And so you have unity. We have unity in that we agree to be here tonight. We have unity in that we agree to talk about this particular topic. We might disagree on some certain things. We don't have unity on that, but we have unity on other
things. So when you think of individuals, the more unity that you have with an individual, another person, then you can form a union. And a union would be the form or arrangement of parts of those having unity. And it's an external quality. So a form is like a structure. It's an arrangement. So you and I could meet together. We could have a friendship. We agree on certain things. A friendship would be a type of union. You can start a business with a group, and if you can agree on your goals and et cetera,
on the product you're going to produce, then you can have a union, and that business is a union. You could start a school. You could decide to have and agree with others about the teacher and what's going to be presented. Then you have a union. The school, the class is a union. So there's just scads of unions. I mean, we don't give it a lot of thought, but you do think about it, and you think, boy, I don't agree with that person, or I do agree with that person. The more agreement that you have, the stronger the union you have. A church is a union. A church is a bunch of believers who come together and they have agreement on doctrine and different ways the service will go and who we would have as a pastor, and boom, you've got a union. If you don't agree on those things, then guess what happens? You have disunion, right? And so a nation is a union. In 1861, our nation was split. We had disunion, and we didn't have the agreement. A marriage is the hardest union. Can you imagine why?
I can't imagine.
A marriage is so hard because there's so many areas of agreement that you strive to reach on. My goodness, it's not like a friendship. You agree on 5 or 6 things, when you're going to watch the Super Bowl, Marriage goes way beyond that. How much you're going to save, where you're going to work, where you're going to live, how you're going to raise your kids, where you go to church, what you're going to do with your family, what car you're going to buy, what kind of house it just goes on. And how you're going to spend vacations, where you're going to go, how you're going to treat relatives. It just goes. So all of these decisions, and the more you agree on, the stronger the marriage. The more you agree on. So to strengthen a marriage, look at those areas and see if you can build unity, build agreement. And so that's a very important thing in American history. See, we didn't have a king who comes through and conquers a bunch of people and sets up a kingdom, forcing people into believing certain things. And what do we have? We have states that are and localities, and we have groups of people in those localities, and they work for unity, and they accomplish personal freedom, individuality, self-government, Christian character. See, all of these internal qualities are important in building that unity. Now, when you lose those, if you stop, as we have, as an example, with having, let's say, reading the Bible in schools, which was a huge, cohesive force in education for a couple centuries. I mean, you're looking at 200 years, 300 years even. 300 years you're looking at. I think the Bible, the 10 Commandments were taken out in 1962, if I'm not mistaken. But you look at, for all that time before, see, those were qualities that they agreed, those have to be taught. Our kids should know that, and there ought to be some agreement on carrying that out. And so, you lose that cohesiveness and you lose your union. See, that's the dangerous part where we are now. Obviously everybody's aware of that we have so many splits and so many discordant voices and philosophies. And you can have discordant philosophies and discordant voices and differences of opinion, but when you get to a more of a radical split, it's harder to hold that union together. So you work for unity, and
That's good. No, I appreciate it, because again, the more united we are, the stronger that we can become, right? Because we work through a representative government, and those representatives are chosen because of the things that we agree on together. So I think it's, I like to close with the unity and union, because I think a big part of why people feel that they have no unity is because they forget that the world exists outside of their cell phone. We get our information, our entertainment, our news, all from the cell phone. The cell phone, everything on your cell phone is curated. It's designed to lead you to something. So if you're not having real conversations with your neighbors, with your friends, how are you going to have unity? How are you going to have a union if you continue to divide over things without even having conversation? You're just listening and watching something. You're like, yep, I agree. Charge. Like, I don't know how many people actually agree with that. That's kind of wild. But when it's hard to control a message because we have no unity, the union falls apart.
Yeah.
So that's why we're part of this ward, right? So we're part of Ward 22. And part of our role in Ward 22 is to show up It's to engage with others. It's to tell other people, hey, you do have value. You do have a role in this. And your responsibility is to show up, to engage, to participate. And if you're not engaging, you're not showing up, you are abdicating your responsibility. You are failing the people that you love. You're failing your family. You're failing your children. Because if we do not stand up, we will not be able to push against the tide that is coming against us. So those who stand for principles, those who stand for Christian character, whether you're a believer or not, welcome to the club. Neither was I until I was, right? Christian principles, it's pretty hard to find one that you disagree with. And you're like, that is just bad, right? So we need to get on the same page. We need to engage with each other and get involved. So what do you think, again, let's bring it back to the value of the individual. Mm-hmm. We as individuals, how should we be participating if we don't even know that we have a role?
Good question. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, but it did hit me as you were talking that in a marriage, that fundamental unit of society, it's easy for those two people to be estranged or misunderstand or not communicate clearly, as you said, not even try to communicate, and there's walls that go up. And so what do? Well, you have to, one person or the other or both has to agree, hey, we're going to work at this. We're going to talk more. We're going to have time where we communicate, where we engage. And I think that's a big part of it. If you tell someone that they value, if you tell your neighbor that, hey, I disagree with you, I know I disagree with you on some things, but I really want to hear your viewpoint here, or I'd like to talk with you about this thing, and you really have a hearing attitude and not, I'm going to shoot you down and tell you what you should believe, but you listen. You see, I think that's building toward a communication that's good. That's a good thing to do. So I don't know if that is a little bit answering your question or not.
John, you've been nailing it all night. Perfect. So the challenge comes down to how are you going to step up? How are you going to get involved? And how are you going to engage? I'd like to open it up to anybody who has any questions on the Big Six. If you want to move up and start moving towards the front. But I think that's great. I think that's a really strong way to close it. And we're going to be doing this more. So Ward 22 is not done with hosting these types of events. We're going to continue to have speakers. And actually something that we're looking for is people in the audience and people that people that are watching that have a unique experience. So if you happen to know somebody who's gone through the arduous process of getting their citizenship and they understand the value of what it means to be a citizen, then we're talking to you, because we need people who value their citizenship, not just people who happen to be born into it. While a birthright is valuable, not having anything and then walking into freedom is like difference between night and day. There's a reason people come here from around the world. It's because we have something special. So I want to know what you have that's special and how we can use it to help shape our ward, our county, our state, and our entire country for the betterment. Do we have any questions ready? We got a question right there. Perfect.
Kind of a question and comment. What you were talking about with a marriage, that person has to value that marriage and that relationship enough to want to do some work, to want to put themselves out. Oftentimes those things are not comfortable, to do with your neighbor. It's easier to just say, forget him or her. And I think that's what I'm seeing. I ran for office a few times here in Albuquerque area. And what I'm seeing, and with our own children, is not valuing America very much. And that a lot of the children and young people have been taught that America's bad and that it's not worth valuing. And that, I think that's where we really need to start with a lot of people, is then to value America. And that's part of what you're saying with people who come here. They're coming here because they value what we have. And so I think, but we need to reteach Americans and Mexicans particularly that value.
I will say one thing. The funny thing about truth is it's kind of hard to keep it down. You can only lie for so long. So saying America is trash might be a political ploy of the moment, but the truth always comes out, and the truth will set you free. We know that things are being revealed. We know that things are being brought to light. We know the value that America has, and that's why we continue to stand. Do you have anything to say about value?
Yeah, I would just say Mary had a great point there, and I think we have to educate ourselves. We have to, and that's why you guys are all here. This is the choir. We're preaching to the choir tonight because that's why you're here tonight. And but you're going to be building, and you're building very. It's a slow process, but I would encourage you to engage with your kids. I've got kids that don't agree with me, and I've taught classes, and I've even taught them, and they don't agree with me on things. They've been influenced by secular humanist professors and et cetera, and people who've torn down America, and so how do we go against that? Well, I think you do the same thing as you would in any relationship. You just try to reestablish ground and a relationship with them, and you carry a lot more. I'm going to encourage you a little bit here. I think you carry a lot more weight with your kids and people that you know than you realize, because you are credible. See, that professor that put those lousy ideas in their mind, and they got indoctrinated somehow. That professor, they only had, they only saw them whatever, short period of time, but they've seen you, and if you're like me, you have flaws, so they've seen your good side and your bad side, but they've seen you over a time, over a period, and you've been a faithful parent, you've been their parent, and you're consistently opening your life and encouraging them to engage. And I think if they see that, then there's ground to build on. So I think there's hope because of that length of and that genuine relationship that a parent has, or even it doesn't even have to be with your children. It could just be with a friend, a neighbor. So they've seen you have that track record of being that neighbor, and so there's good ground to build on with that. So listen to them, and figure a way to plant a seed. Think of a seed that you could plant and do that.
Very well said. Thank you, John. Anybody have any other questions?
I'd like to make a comment about something you mentioned just a little while ago about people just looking at their phones and just believing everything they see on their phone and just saying, oh, I'm going to go with that. And I just want to point out a couple of just really quick examples. Is one argument that's going on right now is about the 14th Amendment, and they're talking about birthright citizenship. And what you'll hear is you'll listen to mainstream news outlets read the first part of the 14th Amendment and not the remaining part of it. They read the part that favors their point of view,
Right.
what the idea they want to push. And then the other thing that kind of surprised me today, I was listening to a lot of debate going on in Congress about the Panama Canal, and they were talking about the Panama Canal Treaty from 1977 that Carter helped enact, and they failed to mention that treaty expired at the end of 1999, so it has no force. We have no saying in the Panama Canal at all anymore. Panama owns it outright, and that our control over the canal is no longer, and they don't mention that.
Sure. Thanks for telling me that, and thank you for Rebecca for telling us that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. What is an American?
What is an American? What? Are you talking about you're like a patriot, American patriot, or like?
Are all Americans patriots?
Are all Americans patriots? No, I don't think. I think a patriot would be someone who loves their country. And not everyone loves their country.
So my generation is under attack with a major identity crisis. And I think that the definition of an American is extremely important for all of us to understand. And I feel nervous asking this question because I think it's divisive, even in this room, to try to define what an American is. I see Americans who hate this country. I see Americans who love it. I see outsiders who hate it and want to be here because they want to take what we have for themselves and send it back to their home. I see them as no more than marauders and pillagers. And I see outsiders that come here and love it, and they embody what my idea of an American is more than the natives that I live with.
There's a really good essay, and it was written by a guy back in the 1800s, and the essay was called "What is an American?" And I can't even remember how to pronounce his name, Courcevore or something like that. He's a Frenchman, come to America, and that would be a good thing to read through, and because it's not a view from 25 where we are right now, but it is a view from the 1800s, and they were looking at those qualities that kind of define Americans.
One of the things that defines Americans are those we've been blessed with many opportunities, and we've grown many inventions, in many ways in our culture. We've grown ways of learning and communications. So all of these kind of things coming hand in hand, but he noticed that it was that westward movement, that desire to improve your situation, and that might be why some of those people in the other countries want to come here. Uh, you know, and for me, I see probably the number one reason the colonists came was religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to worship freely, freedom of religion.
I have a few thoughts on that topic. What is an American? It's something I believe very strongly, but I think being American, whether you're an immigrant that comes here and wants to become an American, I think what it is to be an American is you embrace our values, and the idea of freedom and the concepts that are put forth within our Constitution. I think that's what makes you an American.
I think it's two parts, right? So there's cerebral part where we all want to believe that it's the patriot. So are we confusing patriot with American? I think American is also fairly geographical, right? There's someone who's from an Afghan, someone who's from Iraq, or someone who's from anywhere, right? There's a geographical component to it, but then we have different things that go back to the unity and the union. It is the unity that we originally had that led to the union. We had these basic sets of principles, and everybody said, okay, we're going to start running west. We're going to carry these principles with us, and these principles are American values. So I think the problem is we have lost the values of the Americans, which is why we get confused when the question comes up. Because without the values, being an American simply
means that you were fortunate enough to not even know how lucky you are. You were born in a place with a silver spoon. I don't care how bad you had it. Unless you were born into trafficking or into a family where there was drug or abuse. Look, I understand circumstances can be circumstances and they're not good. And when they're not good, it can cause you to feel a whole myriad of ways. But I'm talking about just being born here. We are so blessed And as Americans, we have no idea the value. And that's why when we talk about why is it that people who are immigrants who come here and go through the arduous process of becoming a citizen, they understand the fundamentals of what it means to be an American because they have to be trained. We used to be trained, we used to be taught in school what it meant to be an American. Now they want to take out the flag, they want to take out the Ten Commandments, they want to gut everything that makes us Americans. So I think we need to get back to the American values. Put the value back in American, and then you won't have to struggle with wondering what it means. And it won't just be geographical. It will be the unity that leads to our reuniting of the Union. I would say that is my answer. And unfortunately, I wish it would be a better, more patriotic answer.
So with that in mind, Andrew, just a thought occurred to me. It used to be on September 17th, used to be Constitution Day. And they say that it still is. However, on that day, our federally funded schools and federally funded agencies are supposed to be training and providing, citizenship and the principles. How many of our schools are actually doing it?
Yeah, probably not very many.
One thing I would suggest that people do, and I mention this all the time, read the Constitution. It doesn't take long to read it. And it's written in very plain language so that anybody can understand what it says. And I'm ashamed to say that up until 3 or 4 years ago, I had never read the U.S. Constitution. And everybody needs to read it. You can read it in no time flat. Less than 15 minutes, you can read it.
Well, I second that. It's important. It's important. John, do you have any final parting thoughts before we close out?
I agree with you about the Constitution, and it's a beautiful document, and the ideas expressed are really profound. And so I would agree. I'd encourage you to read the Constitution. Yep.
Well, thank you, everybody. We appreciate it. We appreciate you coming. Oh, we got one more. Let's do it.
I swore an oath to that Constitution. You don't swear an oath to something unless you know exactly what it is. Does anybody have any problem with that? I served 28 years in the military with that oath. That oath is still binding to this day.
Well, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. We appreciate you. And that oath is binding. And I do think, unfortunately, a lot of people do swear that oath without really thinking about what it is that they're thinking about. We have one more question, and I definitely want to get yours. Mr. Pete Comstock.
One of the things the young man had asked, what is an American? First and foremost, it's citizenship. And that's what we're talking about. The citizenship is everything you've talked about right here of who we are. And you can't be an American or call yourself an American unless you're a citizen. That's the first thing. Now, how do you become a citizen? Yeah, you're lucky enough to be born that way. 2, you immigrate. And if you've ever been, any of you have ever been to a naturalization ceremony and find out what an immigrant actually goes through to learn about our country and what they know to be a citizen, and then be sworn in and see the tears. I've been there, I get tears thinking about it. Then you realize what being an American is. And that's being a citizen. And with citizenship comes everything you've talked about this evening.
I look around this room and everybody looks different. Completely. Yet you're all Americans. I am Irish, Scottish, Italian, and Cherokee. But I'm an American. I was born here. My parents were born here. I've served this country. I have been here for a long time. And what do I see here? I see a room full of friends, even though you don't look like me. Most of you are thankful you don't look like me.
That's right. Well, that's a good place to wrap it up. So thank you, everybody, for coming. We look forward to the next time. So we'll go ahead and make sure we send out this this video as a link, and we'll do it again soon. So thank you very much. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.